Welcome to Mild Wild Crafts. Today what we're going to be working on is a baby toy. February is Valentine's Day, so it seemed like a good choice for this month. Yes, this is a baby toy. It's a block, it's squishy, it has a rattle in it, and it has a handle for hanging if you want to hang it from a crib, a high chair, car seat, stroller, whatever. So sit back, relax, and here we go. So step one is to choose your fabric. Babies tend to explore the world through touch, through sight, so with the different colors. They tend to explore the world a lot with their mouths too, which means we don't want anything that would come off or hurt the baby in some way. So I have here a variety of different fabrics. All of these would be good choices, although some of them do need a little bit of extra work to make sure that they're safe. So one of those things that requires extra work would be if you use something like this lace edge, you would need to stitch down all of these points so that they don't come off and get pulled off or damaged. This one also, it has a nice, it's lace, but it has a nice raised embossed velvety sort of texture. So it's a little sheer, so you might need to line it with some other sort of fabric. So in this case I've shown it over a fleece. The terry cloth is nice. It has an interesting texture to it, but some of the edges will sometimes come off, so you just need to make sure that you finish off the edges enough. The satin is beautiful. This fleece is a little bit fuzzy, so again it's a different texture. Here's another fleece as another example. This one is cotton. It's a little bit stiffer, but again it's perfectly fine for these blocks. So let's take a minute here and talk about ribbons. There are a lot of different ribbons out there. There are a lot of different possible options. Honestly, a lot of times I will just use scraps of whatever I have left for this. So you can see I keep mine in a bag here. And, you know, there's a little of this, a little of that. They all could work. If you have something like this, you want to make sure that it's not going to fall apart when you go to use it. So this one is actually a pretty good one. It should be okay. And again, you want to make sure that it's long enough to make a decent sized loop, kind of like this. So this one is just on the cusp of what would really work. Something like this would be fine. If you find that it has wire in the edges, cut your ribbon, take the wire out before you use it, because we don't want any babies poked with wire. Something like this one has a nice edge to it. Again, it's interesting. Just make sure that this embroidered edge isn't going to pull off when you go to use it. If you have gilt or gold or sparkly things on there, just make sure that it's not going to rub off and that it's going to survive the wash. So any of these could work. You want to cut your ribbon. I generally aim for about 6 to 8 inches. If you're using a skinny ribbon like this one, this may pull out of your stitching because you're going to be stitching this into your seams. So you may want to cut it a little bit longer and just tie a nice chunky knot in it, just to make sure that it's not going to pull through your seam. So if you put your seam across here, this knot isn't going to pull through. So this will still be safe to use for the baby. So let me show you how we cut out our fabric. I generally use 3-inch squares. I'll use our lined fabric as our example. Basically, you just need to line up your ruler along one edge of the fabric. If it's not already square, kind of make yourself a nice straight line to start with. So we'll start by cutting this side. The other side looks like it might be a touch wavy, so we'll turn the fabric around and trim the other side. So we'll line up our ruler along the edge of the fabric. And we cut. So now we have a strip that's 3 inches wide, and then the next part is pretty easy. All you have to do is cut crossways. So again, line up your fabric with one of the lines on the ruler so that you're cutting square corners. This end the end on this was torn, so I'm going to cut it off. It's not particularly necessary on this fabric, but it just makes for a nice clean edge. And then you just cut back down this way. You can pull that out and cut the next one the same way. So I've stitched all 6 of our squares together. You can see I've made our little T. If you get to this point and say, oh no, I forgot my ribbon, don't worry about it. You can put it into one of these other seams that you'll be sewing up. So you'll just lay your ribbon in along the seam in the corner, kind of like that. And then, whoops, if it decides to get away from you, you can stick a pin in it if you feel like it. Honestly, it's not strictly necessary unless you're working with very slippery fabrics. And sometimes ribbons are a little slippery. So we've pinned that in place. The next step that you're going to do is to start making this flat piece into a cube. But before we do that, just a quick word. I have not pressed any of these seams. Honestly, with the choices of fabric that I've made, this is a velvet, this is cotton, this is fleece, this is probably cotton, this is polyester. They would all have to be pressed at different temperatures, and so it's not really going to make any difference. If you're just using something like quilting cotton, you absolutely could go ahead and press these seams if you wanted to. So, to transform this flat piece into a 3-dimensional structure, we need to start folding it up. So we're going to stand this up. These 2 will be our sides, just like this. They're a bit floppy, but you get the idea. You're going to stitch along these bottom seams here. So I'll pin and stitch. So I've finished sewing these first set of side seams. I've attached the ribbon. You can see where I've stitched across the bottom here. So the next step is pretty much like the last one. We just tip it forward one more time, and you can start to see how this is actually starting to look like a cube. For our last step, of course, we'll attach it this way. So for this next step, what you're going to do is just lay it across, and if your fabrics are a little bit slippery, or if you're new to sewing, just stick a couple of pins along the edge. Ordinarily, I like to pin way back from my seam allowance, but these pieces are far too small to do that. The only thing you need to worry about is if you have a ribbon on the inside, make sure that your ribbon isn't going to get caught in the new seam. So I've sewed the next seam, and I just have the buttons in here so that it's propping the entrance open so you can kind of see what we're doing here. We have the 2 sides. We have this one sewn, the back one sewn, this bottom one is sewn. The last one to sew is this red satin. So again, we're just going to pick this up, roll it forward, and attach these 2 seams. So the last 2 seams. So we have this one and this one. This last one, we're going to leave open because we still have to stuff our cube. So this is looking a little bit more like a cube now. As you can see, this opening is still here. So what we have to do next, we have to turn it right side out and stuff it with our fiber fill. So when you're going to stuff this, take a small amount of fiber fill, kind of scrunch it up a bit. You don't want your fiber fill to get lumpy in here, so you kind of want to pack it firmly, but not too firmly because you still have to close this. So we'll take small amounts and stuff it in here. If you decide that you want to use something like a jingle bell or something else to make noise in here, you can. So as you stuff this, you can decide if you want to use something like a noisemaker like a jingle bell, or there are also these shaker things that can be used. I don't happen to have any today, but they can go in. Just make sure it's buried really well inside the stuffing so that it's not, poking out through one of the sides like that, because that might hurt the baby. It also might damage the block. So we'll tuck that one in there, and add some more stuffing in on top and around, and when I'm ready to close it up, I'll come back and join you again. So I have this pretty well stuffed. You can see it rolls around. It's not too hard, not too soft, so I think that's a good amount of stuffing. And I have the jingle in there. You can kind of hear it a little bit. Whatever noisemakers you put in will be somewhat muffled because of the stuffing that's in there. So the last thing we have to do, you have to turn the edges to the inside and stitch this closed. I'm going to use a couple of pins because this red fabric is a little bit slippery and I don't really want this to go anywhere. If you have slippery fabrics or stretchy fabrics, or if you're new at this, it's a good idea to pin these closed, and you can always use pins. So to close this, I have a needle and thread, and this is the same color that I've used all along. It does show a little bit on some of these, but because this gray is quite neutral, it blends in pretty well for most of them. Obviously it stands out a bit more against the black than it does against the red, but it still works pretty well, and frankly it's not going to show anyway because it's going to be on the inside. So I've put a knot at the end of a double length of thread. You don't have to use a double length. I like to, just because it means that there's a little bit of extra strength. I'm just going to do a quick little whip stitch here at the corner to make sure that everything is secure. I do have a knot in it, so strictly speaking this might not be necessary, but I like to just make sure, because we don't want any stuffing to come out. The stuffing can be something of a choking hazard if a child tries to eat it. So to do this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring this up a little closer so you can see. I'm going to take the needle and just tuck under the fold here and pull it through, and then tuck under the fold of the red side, which is a little bit more difficult because it's a finer fabric, and pull it through. And as you can see, the stitches basically disappear. You want to keep your stitches reasonably close together so that the stuffing doesn't come out, because really what's the point of stitching it closed if your stitches are too far away. There we go, and it looks like we have a little bit of odd thread bit caught there. We'll get rid of that. And now we can pull this pin and keep going. As I'm stitching, I'm kind of squeezing these closed just to keep them in place. So my last stitch went through the lion fabric. This next one will go through the red fabric fold. Oops, there we go. If your thread does that kind of thing a lot, either try threading your needle from the other end of the thread. So if you're sewing right-handed, you should thread your needle from the side that comes off the spool first. If you're left-handed, thread your needle from the other side. In this case, I have a doubled thread, so it shouldn't really matter. But if your thread is getting tangled a lot, you can use something like beeswax on it to make it a little bit more smooth, so that it doesn't catch and tangle and twist and turn. So if you find your stitches when you pull are kind of bunching up like that, just pull it back out where it belongs, and you can take a stitch in place across like this. Put it through again, just to hold everything in place. So this is our finished block. All of our sides are stitched nicely. It rolls, it hangs, it makes a little noise, very little noise. If you've enjoyed this video, please like me on YouTube, and if you want written directions for this, they are on my blog, which I'll post a link for underneath. And on that blog page there are also some interesting variations for some different ways that you can make these. Have a great time, and thanks again for watching.